It was the kind of snow that came quietly, blanketing the town in a hushed reverence, as if the world itself had paused to admire its own stillness. I had always loved the way winter transformed our small village into something almost timeless. The streets, with their crooked cobblestones and flickering gas lamps, seemed to echo a different era. But that December evening, as I walked home with a scarf pulled high over my nose, something about the air felt wrong. Not cold, not eerie, but taut, as though the world was holding its breath. I noticed it first from the hill that overlooked the square. Beneath the lamplights, a gathering of townsfolk stood murmuring in clusters, their breaths rising in pale clouds. At the center of it all was something that hadn't been there that morning, a structure of wrought iron and dark wood, its towering silhouette stark against the pristine snow. A Christmas market, I heard someone mutter as I approached the crowd. Except it wasn't quite that. Christmas markets were cheerful things, warm lights, roasted chestnuts, laughter spilling from every corner. This one wasn't. The structure before us was a carousel, its ornate horses frozen mid-gallop, their eyes gleaming unerringly beneath the faint glow of lanterns strung along the canopy. Around it, a labyrinth of booths had sprouted like mushrooms overnight, each painted in rich reds and greens. Where did it come from? I asked no one in particular. "No one knows," replied Mrs. Pritchard, the baker's wife. Her hand clutched her son's shoulder tightly, her knuckles pale. "Wasn't here yesterday. She gestured vaguely. It wasn't unheard of for traveling fairs to appear without warning. But this was something else. The booths had an unsettling symmetry, their pointed roofs perfectly aligned. The carousel stood unerringly still, despite the occasional gust of wind that rattled through the square. And yet, there was a pull to it, a kind of magnetic allure. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, their wide eyes gleaming with curiosity. Even I felt it, that inexplicable draw toward the flickering lanterns and the faint hum of music just out of earshot. By nightfall, the square was buzzing. The town, ever hungry for diversion, seemed to have embraced the market's sudden appearance. Booths were lit, and the carousel spun now, its horses bobbing in time with a tune that was at once unfamiliar and hauntingly familiar. I wandered through the stalls, careful not to stray too far from the more crowded areas. There were sweets I didn't recognize, candied apples dipped in silver, pastries dusted with something that shimmered like frost. The air carried a scent that reminded me of cinnamon, but sharper, tinged with something metallic. "Try your luck," a voice rasped, pulling my attention to a booth near the edge of the market. The man behind the counter didn't look like anyone I'd ever seen in town. He was tall and gaunt, his features angular and sharp. His eyes, dark, calculating, lingered on me just a second too long. Before him was a spinning wheel, its surface etched with symbols I didn't recognize. "No, thank you," I murmured, stepping back. But as I turned to leave, I saw her, a little girl, no older than 8, staring intently at the spinning wheel. Her parents were nowhere in sight. "Where are your—" I began, but she darted past me, her attention fixed entirely on the man's booth. He smiled, a crooked, knowing smile, and gestured for her to step closer. That was when the music stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that pressed against your ears and made you feel uncomfortably small. The carousel had halted mid-spin, its horses frozen once more in eerie poses. Around me, the townsfolk whispered, their excitement replaced by unease. When I looked back at the booth, the girl was gone. The crowd dispersed quickly after the music stopped, a wave of unease rippling through the square. Parents tugged their children away from the market stalls, their festive excitement now replaced by hurried whispers and wary glances. I lingered, my feet rooted to the cobblestones as my eyes darted toward the booth where I had last seen the little girl. She was nowhere to be found. The man who had been standing there was gone too, his strange spinning wheel abandoned. The booth stood like an empty husk, its gaudy red and green paint dull beneath the flickering lanterns. My breath fogged in the air as I scanned the square, searching for any sign of her. She must have gone home, I told myself aloud, though the words rang hollow. Something didn't sit right. The carousel groaned to life again, its mechanism creaking like old bones. The music returned, though slower this time, almost mournful, and the carved horses seemed to sneer as they rose and fell. I turned away from the eerie sight, my heart hammering. I made my way to the baker's shop, where I knew Mrs. Pritchard and her son would have gone. She was always protective of little Oliver, never letting him stray far. When I entered, the warmth of the hearth did little to ease the cold knot forming in my stomach. "Did you see her?" I blurted, startling Mrs. Pritchard as she poured tea into two mismatched cups. "See who, dear?" "The girl by the spinning wheel. She vanished." Mrs. Pritchard's face darkened, and her hand trembled slightly as she set down the teapot. "You must be mistaken," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "The children are all home by now. No one's missing." I hesitated, but something in her tone stopped me from pressing further. Instead, I left the shop and stepped back into the night. Snow was falling again, soft and relentless, muffling the sounds of the town. The market glowed faintly in the distance, its lanterns casting long, unnatural shadows. The next morning, the whispers began. "Have you heard?" a woman said to her companion as I passed them in the square. "Little Clara hasn't been seen since last night," the other replied, her voice hushed but urgent. "Her parents said she went to the market." I froze, my thoughts racing. Clara, that must have been the girl I'd seen. My stomach twisted as guilt crept in. Should I have done something? Stopped her from approaching that booth? The carousel's music played again, faint but persistent, carrying on the icy wind. I turned toward the square, my breath catching as I realized the market hadn't budged an inch. Normally, traveling fairs like this one packed up and moved on quickly, but this one seemed rooted, immovable. I couldn't shake the feeling that Clara's disappearance and the market's arrival were connected. That evening, as darkness fell, I decided to return. My instincts told me it wasn't safe, but something stronger, a gnawing need to understand, drew me back to the square. The market was livelier than ever, despite the unease that had spread through the town. Children laughed as they darted between booths, their parents following reluctantly. The air smelled sweeter tonight, almost cloying, like sugar that had burned just slightly. I wandered through the labyrinth of stalls, the festive colors now garish under the dim light. My pulse quickened as I noticed a new addition, a tent at the far end of the market. Its entrance was shrouded by heavy crimson curtains, and a sign above it read, "Krampus Carnival, Wonders Within." Something about the name sent a chill down my spine. I hesitated before stepping closer, the muffled sound of laughter and applause drifting from behind the curtains. A group of children entered, their faces alight with curiosity. No one stopped them, not even their wary parents who stood at a distance, watching. My fingers brushed the edge of the curtain, and for a moment, I thought I heard a faint cry from within. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the sound of bells jingling in some distant corner of the tent. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The first thing that struck me as I stepped through the heavy crimson curtain was the change in the air. It was thick, stifling, and carried an unfamiliar sweetness that made my stomach churn. The space inside was impossibly large, far larger than the exterior of the tent had suggested. Rows of flickering lanterns lined a makeshift corridor, their light casting jagged, shifting shadows on the canvas walls. The sound of laughter echoed faintly, but it wasn't the laughter of joy or delight. It was fragmented, hollow, like the distorted echo of a memory. I forced myself to move forward, my boots crunching on something soft beneath me. When I looked down, I froze. Snow. Inside the tent. A long table stretched before me, laden with oddities. There were glittering snow globes, each containing a scene that seemed to shift when I glanced away: a boy climbing a tree, a girl with a red scarf running through a forest, a tiny fairground filled with motionless figures. As I leaned closer, I thought I saw their eyes move, tracking me, but when I blinked, they were still. Curious, isn't it? The voice startled me. I spun around to find the man from the spinning wheel booth standing just behind me. His smile was too wide, his teeth unnaturally white. He wore the same tattered red coat and scarf, though his presence now seemed larger, more imposing. I was just looking, I stammered, taking a step back. And you've come to the right place for looking, he said, spreading his arms to gesture at the strange display. Every piece here tells a story, if you've the eye to see it. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. Where are the children? His smile faltered for just a moment, but it was enough. Children? He repeated, feigning ignorance. Why, they've all gone home, I'm sure. A little excitement for the season, nothing more. I stepped past him, ignoring his protests. Something deeper within the tent was calling me, a faint, rhythmic sound, like the beating of a drum or perhaps footsteps. The corridor narrowed as I walked, the lanterns growing dimmer with each step. The sweetness in the air thickened, mingling with a faint metallic tang that made my head swim. At the end of the path, I found another curtain, this one black and frayed at the edges. I hesitated, but the sound grew louder. It wasn't footsteps, it was the sound of a carousel. I pushed the curtain aside. The scene before me defied logic. The carousel was there, but it was unlike any I'd ever seen. The horses were twisted and grotesque, their eyes glowing faintly as they moved. Instead of children riding them, there were figures cloaked in shadows, their outlines barely discernible. Around the carousel, small wooden stalls were arranged in a circle, each adorned with faded ribbons and tarnished bells. And in the center of it all stood Clara. Her red coat was bright against the muted colors of the tent, and her face was turned toward the carousel as if entranced. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. The man in the red coat appeared beside me, his expression unreadable. You see, he said softly, it isn't the children who disappear. It's the ones who look too closely. Before I could respond, the carousel slowed, its music warping into something discordant. The figures on the horses turned toward me, their faces still obscured but their presence heavy, suffocating. Clara began to walk toward one of the stalls, her movements stiff, mechanical. Panic surged through me, and I reached out to stop her, but my hand met empty air. It was as if she wasn't really there, just a projection of something far more sinister. What is this place? I demanded, turning to the man. He simply smiled. Krampus has many forms, he said cryptically. This is merely one of his gifts to the curious. Before I could process his words, the carousel roared to life again, and the figures began to step down from their mounts. They were coming for me. I turned to run, but the curtain I had entered through was gone, swallowed up by the endless, shifting canvas of the tent. The music from the carousel became a cacophony, each note jarring, as though the instrument itself was tearing apart. The figures dismounting the grotesque horses were slow, deliberate, and yet, the space between us seemed to shrink with unnatural speed. Clara! I shouted, though my voice felt swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. She remained entranced, now standing before a stall adorned with wilting wreaths and rusted sleigh bells. Something stirred in the shadows of the stall, long, spindly fingers emerging first, followed by a face that looked both ancient and childlike, its eyes glinting with cruel curiosity. Run! I screamed at her again, but she didn't flinch. The man in the red coat was nowhere to be seen. Or perhaps he was everywhere. I couldn't be sure anymore. His presence lingered in the shadows, in the air, in the dissonant music. The stall's creature stretched further into the dim light, revealing a patchwork body stitched together from what looked like old, tattered fabric. Yet it moved with a terrible fluidity, its hands reaching toward Clara's shoulder. My heart pounded as I lunged toward her, desperate to break whatever spell held her captive. The moment I touched her, the tent seemed to ripple as though alive. Clara turned to face me, but her expression was wrong. Her eyes were wide, pupils blown, and her smile was far too fixed, far too wide. "Isn't it beautiful?" she murmured in a voice that wasn't hers. "The gifts he brings us." My hand recoiled as though burned. The air grew heavy, oppressive, pressing against me like a physical weight. The figures from the carousel were closer now, their features becoming clearer. They weren't shadowy forms at all, but something worse, distorted reflections of people I thought I recognized. The baker from town, his eyes sunken and empty. The schoolteacher, her face stretched into an eternal scream. They were wrong, their humanity twisted into grotesque parodies. The creature at the stall stepped back, melting into the darkness, and Clara began to walk toward the carousel. I grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back, but she felt unnaturally heavy, as though rooted to the ground. "Let her go," a voice hissed from behind me. I spun around and found myself face to face with the man in the red coat once more. But his appearance had changed, his eyes burned with a flickering, ember-like light, and his smile was no longer merely unsettling but monstrous, as though his jaw could unhinge at any moment. "She chose to stay," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "As they all do. She's just a child." I shouted. My voice cracked, fear lacing every word. "And children are the most willing," he replied. "Their hearts are light, eager to believe. But it is not her time yet, not fully." With a sudden, violent motion, he snapped his fingers. The carousel screeched to a halt, and Clara crumpled to the ground as though a puppet whose strings had been cut. I knelt beside her, shaking her lightly, but she didn't stir. The man loomed over us, his shadow stretching impossibly long across the floor. "You can leave," he said, his tone mocking. "Take her, if you wish. But the carnival stays, and its games must be played." I didn't trust him, not for a moment, but I had no choice. I hauled Clara into my arms, her small frame cold and limp. As I turned to flee, the man's laughter echoed around me, mingling with the distant music. The tent twisted around me, the corridor reappearing where there had been none before. I stumbled forward, my steps uneven, each moment feeling as though I were walking against the pull of a tide. The lanterns sputtered and died as I passed them, leaving me in near darkness. My breath came in ragged gasps, the scent of the sweet, cloying air making my stomach churn. Finally, I burst through a curtain, this time it was green and gold, and found myself outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I collapsed to my knees, still clutching Clara. Around me, the carnival was silent. The lights were dim, the rides motionless. The crowd was gone, as though the place had never been alive at all. But as I looked down at Clara, she opened her eyes. They weren't hers anymore. Clara's eyes locked onto mine, but they weren't hers, not the warm, curious gaze of my little sister, but something vast and hollow, reflecting the muted carnival lights behind me. They glowed faintly, flickering like distant stars. I froze, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. "Clara?" I whispered, though her name felt foreign on my tongue now. She tilted her head, slow and mechanical, her expression blank. Then she smiled, not a child's smile, but something learned, calculated. The cold wind stung my face as I shook her gently. "Clara, we have to go." Her lips parted, and her voice, soft yet unnerving, broke the stillness. Why would I leave when the carnival has so much to offer? My heart seized. It wasn't just her voice, it was layered, as though someone, or something, was speaking through her. I turned, searching the darkened carnival for any sign of the red-coated man, but the place seemed abandoned. The lights that had dazzled moments ago now flickered weakly, as if drained of life. The rides stood like skeletons, their festive colors muted to ashen grays under the night sky. I grabbed her wrist and pulled her to her feet. Her body moved, but there was resistance, a stiffness that wasn't physical but felt deeply wrong. "We're leaving," I said firmly, as if saying it aloud could somehow make it true. Clara's head jerked toward the Ferris wheel, now unmoving and ghostly against the horizon. "They're waiting," she said, her tone almost dreamy. I followed her gaze and felt the breath leave my lungs. Figures, pale, translucent shapes, stood at the base of the Ferris wheel. They were children, their outlines hazy, their forms shifting like smoke caught in a draft. Some clutched faded toys, others held hands, their expressions distant. And yet, they all turned their heads toward us in unison. "Don't look at them," I stammered, though I couldn't tear my eyes away. Their faces were not hostile, but their gaze was piercing, pulling at some deep, unspoken fear within me. Clara's fingers slipped from my grip, and she began walking toward them. "No!" I shouted, grabbing her arm again. Her strength surprised me. She nearly pulled me off balance. "Clara, stop." The laughter came then, low and guttural, rolling across the empty carnival like thunder. I spun around, searching wildly for its source. The man in the red coat was nowhere to be seen, but his presence was unmistakable. The air seemed to pulse with it, heavy and charged. The Ferris wheel groaned, its skeletal frame lurching to life. The lights on its carriages blinked feebly, like dying stars. The figures at its base began to ascend, one by one, stepping into the creaking gondolas. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as though obeying an unseen command. And Clara was trying to follow. Desperation surged within me. I scooped her into my arms, her small frame writhing against me like a trapped animal. Her strength wasn't natural. She twisted and clawed, her expression vacant yet intent on breaking free. I stumbled backward, nearly falling as the laughter grew louder, echoing from everywhere and nowhere. The sound of bells, sharp, shrill, and unrelenting, cut through the night. I turned toward the carnival's entrance, the gates still glowing faintly in the distance. If I could just get us out, if I could just... Clara's voice cut through my thoughts, a chilling whisper against my ear, "You'll never leave." Something cold and sharp scraped against my neck, and I flinched, nearly dropping her. I looked down and froze. Her fingers, once small and delicate, were elongating, the tips curving into claw-like points. Her face was still Clara's, but her eyes were black now, endless voids that reflected nothing but the faint carnival lights. I didn't think, I ran. The carnival blurred around me, the wind slicing at my face as I sprinted toward the gates. Clara's weight in my arms felt heavier with each step, her writhing more frantic. The bells grew louder, a cacophony that seemed to pierce my very thoughts. The gates loomed closer, their iron bars warped and twisted like something alive. As I approached, they began to close, the space between them narrowing. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning, my breath ragged. Clara let out a sound, a shriek that wasn't hers, high-pitched and inhuman. I dove through the narrowing gap just as the gates slammed shut behind me. I landed hard on the frozen ground, Clara tumbling from my arms. I scrambled to my feet, turning to look back at the carnival. It was gone. No lights. No rides. No sound. Just an empty field, blanketed in snow. I turned to Clara, who lay still, her chest rising and falling shallowly. Her eyes were closed, her face peaceful, as if she were merely asleep. For a moment, hope flickered within me. "Clara?" I whispered, kneeling beside her. Her eyes fluttered open, and I felt my stomach drop. They weren't her eyes. Clara's eyes opened wide, vast and black, pulling me into their depths. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The world around me blurred, and I felt untethered, as if the snow-covered field had vanished, leaving me suspended in an endless void. Then she blinked, and her eyes returned to their normal, bright hazel. "Arthur," she murmured, her voice weak, trembling like the faint jingle of a sleigh bell. I staggered backward, the echoes of her inhuman shriek still ringing in my ears. You're back," I stammered, unsure whether to embrace her or run. She sat up slowly, her movements hesitant, confused, as if waking from a long, fevered dream. Snow began to fall, soft flakes catching in her hair, and for a brief moment, the world seemed ordinary again. But then I heard it, the faint sound of bells. Not the cheery peals of holiday joy, but something discordant, sharp. I turned toward the empty field where the carnival had stood, and my heart sank. The faint outline of the Ferris wheel shimmered in the falling snow, like a mirage caught between two worlds. And just beyond it, the red-coated man stood, his silhouette stark against the pale haze. Clara didn't seem to notice. She looked at me, her brow furrowed. "Arthur, what happened?" I remember the lights, and then, nothing. I knelt before her, gripping her shoulders tightly, as if anchoring her to reality. "We have to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "We have to go home." But even as I spoke, I knew it wasn't over. The carnival wasn't gone, it had merely receded, retreating into some dark corner of existence where it waited for the next unwitting visitor. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it had marked us, that its shadow would follow wherever we went. I pulled Clara to her feet, and we began the long walk back to town. The snow fell heavier now, muffling our footsteps, and the night seemed unnaturally silent. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. What had the carnival been? Why had it chosen Clara, or me? And why had it let us go? We reached the edge of the village as the church bells tolled midnight. Christmas Eve had ended, and Christmas Day had begun. Warm light spilled from the windows of the houses, and I could hear faint laughter, the clinking of glasses. The world seemed to breathe again, alive with the cheer of the holiday. But I felt none of it. Inside, my parents greeted us with frantic relief. They pulled Clara into their arms, her pale cheeks flushed now with warmth. Questions flew. Where had we been? What had happened? But I had no answers, only a vague excuse about getting lost in the snow. They didn't press further, perhaps sensing the fragility of the moment. That night, I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling. Clara slept soundly in the room next to mine, her breathing steady, normal. Yet I couldn't shake the image of her black eyes, the voice that wasn't hers. I tried to tell myself it was over, that we were safe. But deep down, I knew the truth. The carnival had left something behind. As dawn broke, I ventured into Clara's room to check on her. She was sitting up in bed, cradling something in her lap. My breath caught in my throat as I saw it, a small, carved figurine of the Ferris wheel, perfectly crafted in dark wood. It hadn't been there before. "Where did you get that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She looked up at me, her expression serene. "It was on my windowsill," she said. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" I stepped closer, my stomach churning. The tiny gondolas swung gently, though there was no breeze. As I stared, I noticed small shapes inside each carriage, figures, faint but unmistakable. Children. And one of them had Clara's face. Before I could speak, a faint sound filled the room, rising from the figurine itself, the distant chime of bells, faint and haunting. I snatched the thing from her hands and hurled it across the room. It struck the wall with a dull thud and fell to the floor, unbroken. Clara gasped, startled, but I couldn't explain. My hands trembled as I backed away. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in deceptive purity. But as I looked out the window, I saw them, footprints leading away from our house. Small footprints. And in the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow, I caught a flash of red. The carnival was waiting. And it always would be.